The Quest for Meekness and Quietness of Spirit by Matthew Henry. Chapter 1. The Nature of Meekness and Quietness of Spirit. Meekness and quietness seem to import much the same thing, but the latter, having something of metaphor in it, will illustrate the former, and therefore we shall speak of them distinctly. Part 1. We must be of a meek spirit. The critics translate the word facilis as easy. Meekness is easiness of spirit, not a sinful easiness to be debauched, as Ephraim's, who willingly walked after the commandment of the idolatrous princes, Hosea chapter 5 verse 11. Nor a simple easiness to be imposed upon and deceived, as Rehoboam's, who when he was 40 years old is said to be young and tender-hearted, 2 Chronicles chapter 13 verse 7. But a gracious easiness to be wrought upon by that which is good, as theirs whose heart of stone is taken away, and to whom a heart of flesh is given. Meekness is easiness, for it accommodates the soul to every occurrence, and so makes a man easy to himself and to all about him. The Latins call a meek man mansuetus, manu asuetus, used to the hand, which alludes to the taming and reclaiming of creatures wild by nature, and bringing them to be tractable and familiar. James chapter 3 verses 7 and 8. Man's corrupt nature has made him like, quote, the wild donkey used to the wilderness, or the swift dromedary traversing her ways. Jeremiah chapter 2 verses 23 and 24. But the grace of meekness, when that gets dominion in the soul, alters the temper of it, brings it to the hand, submits it to management, and now the wolf dwells with the lamb, and the leopard lies down with the kid, and a little child may lead them. For enemies are laid aside, and there is nothing to hurt or destroy. Isaiah chapter 11 verse 6 and 9. Meekness may be considered with respect both to God and to our brethren. It belongs to both the tables of the law, and attends upon the first great commandment, Thou shalt love the Lord thy God, as well as the second, which is like unto it, Thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself, though its special reference is to the latter. Section 1. There is a meekness toward God, and it is the easy and quiet submission of the soul to his whole will, according as he is pleased to make it known, whether by his word or by his providence. Part A. It is the silent submission of the soul to the word of God, the understanding bound to every divine truth, and the will to every divine precept, and both without murmuring or disputing. The word is then an engrafted word, when it is received with meekness. James chapter 1 verse 21. That is, with a sincere willingness to be taught and a desire to learn. Meekness is a grace that cleaves the stalk and holds it open, that the word, as the imp or shoot, may be grafted in. It breaks up the fallow ground and makes it fit to receive the seed. It captivates the high thoughts and lays the soul like white paper under God's pen. When the dayspring takes hold of the ends of the earth, it is said to be turned as clay to the seal. Job chapter 38 verses 12 through 14. Meekness does, in like manner, dispose the soul to admit the rays of divine light which before it rebelled against. It opens the heart as Lydia's was opened. It sets us down with Mary at the feet of Christ, in the place and posture of the learner. Deuteronomy chapter 33 verse 3. The promise of teaching is made to the meek, because they are disposed to learn. The meek will he teach his way. Psalms chapter 25 verse 8 and 9. The word of God is gospel indeed, good tidings to the meek. Isaiah chapter 61 verse 1. They will entertain it and bid it welcome. The poor in spirit are evangelized. Matthew chapter 11 verse 5. And wisdom's alms are given to those that with meekness wait daily at her gates, and like beggars wait at the posts of her door. Proverbs chapter 7 verse 34. The language of this meekness is that of the child Samuel. Speak, Lord, for thy servant heareth. 1 Samuel chapter 3 verse 9. And that of Joshua, who, when he was in that high post of honor, giving command to Israel, and bidding defiance to all their enemies, his breast filled with great and bold thoughts. Yet upon the intimation of a message from heaven, thus submits himself to it. What saith my Lord unto his servant? Joshua chapter 5 verse 14. And that of Paul, and it was the first breath of a new man, Lord, what wilt thou have me to do? Acts chapter 9 verse 6. And that of Cornelius, quote, And now we are all here present before God to hear all things that are commanded thee of God. Acts chapter 10 verse 33. And that of the good man I have read of, who, when he was going to hear the word, used to say, quote, Now let the word of the Lord come, and if I had 600 necks I would bow them all to the authority of it. End quote. To receive the word with meekness is to be delivered into it, as into a mold. It seems to be Paul's metaphor, Romans chapter 6, verse 17, that form of doctrine, quote, into which you were given up, end quote. Meekness softens the wax, that it may receive the impression of the seal, whether it be for, quote, doctrine or reproof, for correction or instruction in righteousness, end quote. It opens the ear to discipline, silences objections, and suppresses the risings of the carnal mind against the word, consenting to the law that it is good, and esteeming, quote, all the precepts, concerning all things to be right, even when they give the greatest check to flesh and blood. Part B. It is the silent submission of the soul to the, quote, providence of God concerning us. Section 1. When the events of providence are grievous and afflictive, displeasing to sense and crossing our secular interests, meekness not only quiets us under them, but reconciles us to them, and enables us not only to bear, but to receive evil as well as good at the hand of the Lord, which is the excellent frame that Job argues himself into, Job chapter 11, verse 10. It is to kiss the rod, and even to accept of the punishment of our iniquity, taking all in good part that God does, not daring to strive with our Maker, no, nor desiring to prescribe to him, but dumb and not opening the mouth, because God does it. How meek was Aaron under the severe dispensation which took away his sons with a particular mark of divine wrath. Quote, he held his peace. Leviticus chapter 10, verse 3. God was sanctified, and therefore Aaron was satisfied, and had not a word to say against it. Unlike to this was the temper, or rather the distemper, of David, who was not like a man after God's own heart, when he was, quote, displeased because the Lord had made a breach upon Uzziah, 2 Samuel chapter 6, verse 8. As if God must have asked David leave thus to assert the honor of his ark. When God's anger is kindled, ours must be stifled. Such is the law of meekness, that whatsoever pleases God must not displease us. David was in a better frame of mind when he penned the 56th Psalm, the title of which, some think, bespeaks the calmness and submissiveness of his spirit when the Philistines took him in Gath. It is upon Jonath, Elam Rechokim, the silent dove afar off. It was his calamity that he was afar off, but he was then as a silent dove, mourning perhaps, Isaiah chapter 38, verse 14. But not murmuring, not struggling, not resisting when seized by the birds of prey, and the psalm he penned in this frame was Michtam, a golden psalm. The language of this meekness is that of Eli, it is the Lord, 1 Samuel chapter 3, verse 18, and that of David to the same purport, quote, Here I am, let him do to me as seemeth good unto him, 2 Samuel chapter 15, verse 26. Not only he can do what he will, subscribing to his power, for who can stay his hand? Or he may do what he will, subscribing to his sovereignty, for he gives not account of any of his matters. Or he will do what he will, subscribing to his unchangeableness, for he is in one mind, and who can turn him? But let him do what he will, subscribing to his wisdom and goodness, as Hezekiah said, Good is the word of the Lord, Isaiah chapter 39, verse 8. Let him do what he will, for he will do what is best, and therefore if God should refer the matter to me, says the meek and quiet soul, being well assured that he knows what is good for me better than I do for myself, I would refer it to him again. He shall, quote, choose our inheritance for us, Psalm chapter 47, verse 4. Section 2. When the methods of providence are dark and intricate, and we are quite at a loss what God is about to do with us, quote, his way is in the sea, and his path in the great waters, and his footsteps are not known. End quote. Clouds and darkness are round about him. A meek and quiet spirit acquiesces in an assurance that all things shall work together for good to us, if we love God, though we cannot apprehend how or which way. It teaches us to follow God with an implicit faith, as Abraham did when he went out not knowing very well whom he followed, Hebrews chapter 11, verse 8. It quiets us with this, that though what he doeth we know not now, yet we shall know hereafter, John chapter 13, verse 7. When poor Job was brought to that dismal plunge that he could no way trace the footsteps of the divine providence, but was almost lost in that labyrinth, How quietly does he sit down with this thought, quote, "But he knows the way I take. When he hath tried me, I shall come forth as gold." Job chapter 23, verses 8 and 9. Part 2. There is meekness toward our brethren, toward all men. Titus chapter 3, verse 2. And so we take it here. Meekness is especially conversant about the affection of anger, not wholly to extirpate and eradicate it out of the soul, that were to quench a coal which sometimes there is occasion for, even at God's altar, and to blunt the edge even of our spiritual weapons, with which we are to carry on our spiritual warfare. But its office is to direct and govern this affection, that we may, quote, "be angry and not sin." Ephesians chapter 4, verse 26. Meekness in the school of the philosophers is a virtue consisting in a mean between the extremes of rash excessive anger on the one hand, and a defect of anger on the other, in which Aristotle confesses it very hard exactly to determine.